Morning, everybody. Great to see you all here on this chilly morning, and thanks for coming to the latest Teaching and Learning Breakfast Session brought to you by the Teaching Innovation Unit. We're very happy to welcome a visitor from UCF, that's University of Central Florida, Professor Roger Azevedo. He's a visiting Fulbright scholar, and he's visiting the C3L Centre, for those of you who don't know, so he'll be here for 3 weeks doing some work. Obviously, he's doing a presentation today, but he has a workshop on Monday. For those of you who haven't enrolled for that already, there is probably 2 or 3 spots left for Monday. So if you're interested in going to that and you haven't received anything from me, come and see me afterwards. But there are, as I say, probably 4 spots, and that's on Monday from 10:30 to 2:30. So before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge country. I'd like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is the traditional lands for the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. So thanks very much for coming along, and I'll hand over to Roger. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much, Stuart. How's it going? I know it's early. Especially for me. I'm on 4 hours of sleep and fighting jet lag, but it's all good. I'm excited to be here. And before I begin my talk, I'd like to thank George and Shane for extensive communications back and forth and for hosting me here at the C3 lab. And so it's been great also meeting the team, and it's great to meet with you, and hopefully we'll get some interactions going over the next 2.5 weeks, I guess. So before I begin my talk, I would like to also acknowledge that the work I'm going to be presenting is kind of a culmination of about 20 years worth of work. When I started my career at University of Maryland, after I left, I did my Ph.D. at McGill. I grew up in Montreal, went to Carnegie Mellon where I did my postdoc, University of Maryland, University of Memphis, back to McGill as a research chair, found out that Canada doesn't have much money, so I came back to the US, to NC State. Oops, sorry, did I say that out loud? And then left NC State, and I'm now the cluster lead and lead scientist for the learning sciences at University of Central Florida, where my job is basically connect all the different clusters, and we do a lot of interdisciplinary research, which you will see in a little bit. So the focus of my talk today is really measuring. How do we measure and analyze self-regulatory processes? And by self-regulatory processes, what I mean is cognition, emotions or affect, metacognition, and motivation. So I, as a psychologist, I am interested in those processes whenever a human of any age, any size, might as well say that, is interacting with a machine to engage in complex learning about the circulatory system, learning about oncology, making decisions about what breast cancer treatment I should have, etc. So we'll see some examples of that. And we're kind of really tired of using self-report measures because that's what dominates, right? When you use self-report measures to measure somebody's conception of self-regulation, it's about their self-perceptions. As a psychologist, that's great, but what I really want to know is how do you deploy those processes in real time, okay? And what do they look like? How do we measure them? And then how do we feed those back into a system that will have some kind of intelligence to support self-regulation, learning, etc., okay? And so that's kind of what we're going to be, that's the second big chunk of information there in that second line, the multimodal, multi-channel data, right? So we're going to talk about what are some of the methodologies that we use, and also you'll see some of the advanced learning technologies. And also to acknowledge the funding agency, this kind of research involves, well, I would say a village if I was in the US, but involves several nations. We have collaborators all over the world. And it also takes a lot of funding, a lot of money to basically conduct it, as it is very expensive. So I'm very fortunate to have funding also still from Canada and also from the National Science Foundation, IES, and NIH from the US. So in terms of giving you kind of a high-level overview, what we really start off is with theories. As psychologists, we start with theories, models, frameworks of self-regulation. What is self-regulation? Okay, there are different models, for example. We look at some context because self-regulation is enacted basically between a human and a machine or multiple humans and a machine in a particular context, learning context, educational setting, etc. And then the question is, how do we measure those processes, right? So I've kind of been, in a scientific way of using the word, obsessed with measuring these, okay? Not in the clinical sense. Oh, okay, we got a bit of laughter. That's good, all right. So what I'm going to focus on today is, yes, we can measure it before Somebody learns or problem solves a reason. We can measure after, but really want to focus is on the during the activity. Okay, and then what are some of the analyses? Right. So we have statistical analyses, we have data mining, machine learning, etc. Which ones do we use? Are they all applicable? What inferences are we making? And then how do we feed that back into the system so that it becomes intelligent? Okay. And of course, revising our theories and models, because I'll just put it out there. Our theories of models of learning and instruction and cognition, okay, are too abstract, right? They're too abstract, they're too descriptive. They're not predictive, okay? So for example, I love when I go to a conference like AERA, right? And then somebody says, oh yes, I use Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. And I'm like, well, that's wonderful and good for you. Gee, where's the ZDP? How do you define the ZDP? Or somebody says, well, I use Piaget's theory of cognitive disequilibrium. That's wonderful. I'm a scientist. Can you tell me when somebody's engaging in a simulation accommodation? Because I can't crack open their cranium, right, and look for it, all right? So we need to be a little more specific in that. Sorry. I know you're eating breakfast, and cracking craniums is probably not the best example to give. All right. So research agenda, what do we do? So we examine these CAM processes. You're going to see those on some slides: cognition, affect, metacognition, motivation. We started traditionally with cognition and then affect and metacognition. We're slowly getting to the motivation because, as you know, the motivation research is really focused on the use, over-reliance, and use of self-report measures. Okay, and these can happen in educational settings or professional settings, such as medicine or school, when our kids are using STEM. We conduct both basic and applied psychological research. So we'll be in the lab, and I'll show you an example in a couple of slides, where a person is instrumented, and we have full control of what they're doing, okay, and measuring what they're doing. But then we also go into a messy classroom, or we go into a surgical room, where we have a surgeon who's operating on a human, obviously. What else would it be, right? A human. Who's got an eye tracker, and we're actually analyzing the gaze behavior of the surgeon, so then we can accelerate, potentially, residency training by having the residents watch the gaze behavior of the surgeons. And then we basically converge multiple sources of data. So we look at your face, we look at your physiology, we look at log file data, etc. And so one of the questions is, why do you collect so much data? Well, part of it because our theories are impoverished. We still do not know how these processes unfold over time, across context, between a human and a machine. Okay, so we understand. And we also feed a very large international family of computer scientists, for example, at the University of British Columbia, like Christina Canati, or folks in Europe. Okay, we also collaborate with folks at University of Sydney. So, for example, Judy Kay, or Sabina Kleiman, who's also at the University of Sydney, and several other folks. So then we also examine is not only self-regulation, but other regulation. And that's a whole other area of research, which is basically, it's not just about a human self-regulating his or her learning, right? But if you have multiple humans or artificial agents, you can be working with a robot. Well, what does that look like? What is the role of the robot, or the role of the peer, or the students? How do they externally regulate me so that I can perform my task, okay? And of course, then we build these systems in terms of building intelligent systems, and I'll explain some of that. So here's some of the examples over the years that we've developed. In fact, so we'll start with the top left, just a very quick overview to give you a sense. And for those of you doing the workshop, we'll actually have videos of some of these. So the first left is MetaTutor. So this has been funded by close to $7 million over the last 15 years. We gave birth, yes, to this system. Sorry to use that word. Trying to get some laughter here. I know it's early. I'm fighting jet lag. It's the intern. Oh, more coffee. Yes, thank you. So MetaTutor was designed, so my co-PIs at the time actually were Art Gracer and Danielle McNamara and Vasily Rus. And so what we did is basically develop a system to teach college students. Now, we haven't used this with middle school or high school kids or even younger children or medical folks. It's to teach them about the human circulatory system, where I guess pointing doesn't really make a difference because it doesn't. Here, so can I do this? So we will have multiple agents. Okay, we have 4 agents. One is for cognition, all right? So Mary the monitor will help you with the monitoring. Sam the strategizer will help you with learning strategies as you will learn the circulatory system. Pam the planner helped you plan. And then Gavin the guide was the guy who was going to tell you what you were going to be doing for a learning session. So learners learn to associate each of these agents that would pop up based on your behavior or activity in the system as you're learning about the human circulatory system. You have a table of contents, an overall learning goal, and you were forced to submit some goals. So we've done a lot of work in this area, including with IO psychologists, looking at personality traits, etc. So this is a traditional, what we call a traditional intelligent tutoring system. Now, we've also, for the last 8 years, worked with James Lester, who's a colleague at NC State in computer science. He's developed Crystal Island, completely different game. This is a serious game where basically you land on this island and your job as a learner is that you have to solve the outbreak. There's a biological outbreak. You get to talk to the nurse, to the patients, test food items, etc. So it's a little bit of scientific literacy, scientific reasoning, okay, and microbiology. So we've done a lot of work in that area. And so we're focusing now on kind of emotions. So when a kid looks, for example, confused as to why is this non-player character giving me information that I don't need? Well, you think you don't need it, but you actually do need it. Okay, so that's some of the work. So completely different system. And then, so these are traditional systems that can be presented on screens that we're used to, laptops, etc. But now we're also experimenting with some new technologies. So this is what we, in the HCI, call it tangible computing or tangible landscape. What this thing looks like here, looks like a sheet cake, okay? Could be the size of your laptop, can be the size of this room, okay? The idea is it uses kinetic sand that has properties, and as long as you have a computational model, in this particular example, there's a computational model of the weather, okay? And what these students are trying to do is basically prevent the inundation of the coastal system of the coastal region of North Carolina. So we're looking at collaborative problem solving. You notice she's wearing an EEG, she's wearing an electrodermal activity bracelet, and so is he, because we're looking at physiology and synchronicity. And he's wearing a portable eye tracker, okay? And the question is, as they're trying to solve this problem, you're actually, so it involves a lot of embodied cognition, you are actually physically using your hands to create barriers to prevent the inundation of this area. And as you're doing that, this pole basically has a projector that is providing in near real-time changes. So you actually get to see if you are actually effective in stopping the inundation of these houses. Those are what those symbols are. So we've applied this for middle school, high school, college training, especially, for example, if you're in biology, or we have a sustainable coastal systems cluster. But we've also written white papers to the Department of Defense who are interested in this, because these could be 2 platoon commanders, and what you are doing is you're basically moving your human and technological resources through hostile grounds where you might have IEDs, snipers, etc. So you're probably figuring out what is the optimal path. Okay, can also be used for biology. So as long as you have a computational model, we can do that. So very exciting, but it comes back to the same question: how do humans learn from these types of technologies? Right? Technologies keep advancing, but our research is falling way behind. Okay, so we have a problem there. And then the other thing, all right, so this is, I know it's early, this is going to sound really crazy, okay? Oh boy, it's being recorded. So we said, all right, this is wonderful, but what about if I wanted to stick, gets into Ant-Man and Wasp, if I wanted to stick these two humans, I wanted to miniaturize them and insert them into the landscape, right? Because if now I'm doing firefighter training, and these are firefighters, right? Imagine now having a mini-me version of you embedded, where I can actually see and feel the heat, the wind pressure, okay, my inactions, and I can actually then talk and feedback from my mini-me version to the human version of me. Well, apparently biologically, medically, we can't do that yet, which was so devastating. Okay. All right, got a little bit of laughter. All right. I'm trying. So, all right, so with our computer science colleagues, like, all right, we can't do that, so let's simulate that. So you can actually take this pointer, and you can imagine, so here's a different version. You can point to the landscape, and as you point to the landscape, using your VR goggles, you actually get to see where you are. So now, for example, you're teaching kids about STEM, for example, so now you imagine you have the kid point to anywhere in the landscape, it pops up, and now you can actually transverse the landscape, okay? So if you had a haptic glove, for example, teaching kids about birch, what that feels like, or having a data visualization where you're teaching about photosynthesis. So those are some of the things that we're experimenting with right now. Or if you wanted to teach them STEM and non-STEM history, the kid can compare what it looked like 50 years ago, or if we have a planet maybe 50 years from now, okay, what will it look like? So a lot of experimentation, a lot of potentials to do this kind of work. We also do work in, so thinking about different technologies, right? It's not just, is the audio plugged in, Stuart? Sorry. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So the other thing is there's a piece of technology. There's a high-fidelity mannequin. This is about $50,000. This is still when I was at McGill, one of the McGill teaching simulation centers. So here's a pregnant woman who's got pulmonary embolism, and if you have 10 minutes to save the mom and the baby. All right. So now we're looking at team performance. You're going to see a team. The team is outside. The residents, second year and third year medical residents, are sitting outside with an EDA bracelet, and we're collecting baseline, right? We're behind a one-way mirror with the medical staff who developed the case, and also the computer scientist who's actually running this thing. Will talk, okay? And then we have the humans, and so the question becomes, what is the role, looking specifically at the role of emotions in near and end-of-life scenarios? Okay. So just going to give you... Oh, cool. Look, it's like a rock star at a concert. Bring out your lighters. Oh, wait, we don't use lighters anymore. Sorry. I'm dating myself. Can we play it? Thank you. There you go. Huh? I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, and I get feedback. Okay. Okay, you know what? No, that's okay. We'll just move on. You can see it later. Anyways, it's a high-stress environment, so we're kind of figuring out what is the role of individual and self-regulated learning in a high environment, stress environment, where we're pushing the residents basically to the point where we're interfering with their decision-making. Decision-making. And then we take them into a room where we actually play back the video, and the staff, the medical faculty, tell them exactly what they missed out, which is even more anxiety-provoking. So we're thinking about, how can you accelerate learning and training, okay, in these end-of-life scenarios? Other areas that we're working on, the top left is, for example, photosynthesis, where we literally worked with a school where, it's like, oh, I got a 3-week unit for 9th graders on photosynthesis. And we worked with industry partners, and we came up with a VR environment for training them to do photosynthesis. We also work, top right, is with biomedical engineers. Okay, and so the question there is, we actually just submitted an NSF engineering center grant, and the idea is that, yes, we have the engineers, biomedical engineers, and computer scientists who build the best, exoskeletons for lower limb and upper limb prosthetics, but the question is, they always forget the human. So I'm the psychologist on the team who's like, well, why don't we look at the emotions of these patients who are using for the first time or getting used to using these prosthetics, and can we feed their emotions back into the machine so that we minimize the amount of pain and increase the level of performance and adherence, because there's also limb rejection, if you will, when it comes to prosthetics. The bottom left is work that we're doing with construction engineering. So apparently every 6 minutes on our planet, a construction worker dies. Okay? So the idea with construction and engineering was to show the construction workers, what you're seeing there is a heat map, which is a summary of gaze behavior of a construction worker. And the idea is to basically see if they can detect the subtle and not so subtle hazards on a job site. And the idea is then, if we know where you're focusing your attention and the decisions you're making, then we can actually design an intelligence system to help you better detect those and obviously, eliminate the possibility of death. So how do we do this? So those are some of the contexts, not all of them. So how do we do this? Okay. Well, in terms of doing this, the left-hand side, since I'm kind of stuck now here. Hi. The left-hand side is what we do typically in the lab. Okay. As you can see, we are wired this person. We're collecting their facial expressions, their log file there, their physiology, their verbalization, their interactions with the machines, etc. So this is great when we do this in the lab with one person at a time, okay, for using a particular technology so we can measure self-regulation. The question is, the big problem, and this is actually also a problem for us when we collaborate with others across the globe, right? But also, as we move this and scale up, the scaling up issue is a big problem, because that entire setup, that's about $100,000, okay? So if you take this into the classroom, I cannot afford $100,000 times 20 or 30 people. So the question is, what can we do to scale that to the classroom? So what we do is, well, we can't afford a $45,000 or $50,000 eye tracker that's sitting under the screen, so we'll use an inferior eye tracker. Okay, well, we can't have 30 kids doing a think-a-lot at the same time because that would be madness, right? But there's a lot there, so that's a big issue. There's a lot there that we can replicate in the classroom or any other context in the wild. So that's a big question, is how do we take these measures and take them into the real world where it can get messy, okay? Part of it is also things that we take for granted. So this is where our electrical engineer colleagues come into play. So things like, for example, if I have Bluetooth and I have 4 Bluetooth devices in one person, the interference that it causes. So some of it is not even human error. It's basically the machines that are causing errors. Theory, you have to take a slide on theory, right? So behind all this, there is a theoretical framework that hopefully we'll be able to explore in our workshops. We have used Phil Winnie and Alison Hadwin. They're both at, Phil's at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia in Canada, and Alison University of Victoria in Canada. And we have predominantly used our model of self-regulation, and we'll go a little bit into this and the reason why when we do the workshops. Because one real good reason is that this is the only model that exists right now in the literature that actually talks about self-regulation in these processes as temporally unfolding processes that happen over time, okay? So, but we have to make some adaptations. I'm not going to get into that now. Some of the adaptations, when Phil and Alison wrote and actually designed this model when she's still a grad student back in 1998, they built this model for studying as a phenomena. Well, I don't study studying. We study learning, reasoning, problem solving. So of course changes have to be made, okay? And there's a lot of issues here in this model that we still do not have an answer to. So we make an assumption, for example, that a human would actually monitor his or her own learning, because if you are, think about Piaget, I'm gonna go back to Piaget. If you're in equilibrium, right, there's no reason for learning. As soon as you have this equilibrium, right, well, the question is, how do you establish this equilibrium cognitively? Is it because of your standards? Okay, what is it exactly? It makes an assumption, let's move out here for a second. It makes assumptions about people's standards, okay, and how they relate to cognitive evaluations, which we're not going to get into today, but that's one of the issues. And so perhaps an open learner model or a data visualization, right, would help a learner or a teacher or even a parent, okay, analyze students' standards. So when we say, basically, not that we talk like this to students, but why are you not regulating? We don't talk like that. That'd be really interesting. Well, what do you mean, why am I not regulating? I don't know. You want me to regulate? Sorry. So the question is, imagine, well, the assumption as to why you're not regulating is because the fact that you don't have any internal standards. So I might be a young kid, right? I don't have any standards for my reading comprehension. So then why would I be monitoring my reading, okay? So expectations that we make as researchers and educators, right, about what we are seeing and not seeing in terms of self-regulation, the basis could be the fact that you don't have standards. So the question then is, how do you teach the standards to humans so that they can better regulate? The other thing that we did is, this was part of a special issue of Educational Psychologist that we did back in 2015 with Gail Sinatra, who's at the University of Southern California, and some other colleagues, where they were looking at engagement. So I know everybody, that's one of the keywords, right? Engagement, and then what's the new, grit, and then mind wandering, right? We seem to gravitate to these beautiful, very abstract flow, right? Constructs, and the question is like, really? How do we measure these things, okay? So engagement, so what we did here is basically try to summarize, and by no means is this a complete matrix, but try to summarize the different types of data that you would have, whether it's process data, and I'm only going to focus really on the top, on this row right here, is that when we're looking at self-regulation and you're looking at process data, well, here are some methodologies. We have screen recordings that include audio and video, concurrent think aloud protocols. They could also be retrospective protocols, eye tracking, log files, facial expressions of emotion, physiological sensors, and in fact, that physiological sensor row, you can actually break it into the multiple different types of physiological sensors, etc. And then the question becomes, it's almost like a menu, right? So if I wanted to study cognition as a key self-regulatory process, then, well, I could look at cognition, metacognition if I use screen recordings. But I would not use screen recordings to look at affect and motivation, okay? Now, there's some that are in yellow, and that's because sometimes if you are collecting a concurrent think aloud protocol, is that students may say, well, I really hate Sam because he forces me to summarize all the time. It's like, all right, that's pretty strong, kid. Relax. Might have to call the police. No, just kidding. But the question is that your voice, you might actually bleed over, okay? But it's not the predominant use. Does that make sense, folks? Yeah? Okay. And then, of course, product, process, self-report, etc. So during the workshops, it would be, I'd like to give you and expand a little bit more on the process type of data. What does it look like? How do we measure? What are some of the issues that we deal with? And then here's some of the challenges. So we collect multimodal data. So we'll collect your eye tracking data, if you remember that screen, eye tracking, face, etc. So the question is, without getting into and actually putting you to sleep, because this is where it gets a little more complicated, right? What are the challenges? We collect all this data. Then what the heck do we do with all the data? We collected your face data, your physiology, log screen, your handwriting, etc., your cortisol in some cases, okay? Well, the problem is that we still have problems with understanding how these processes work together, right? So if we are collecting multimodal data, right, let's say on an adult who is learning about the human circulatory system, so you're showing prolonged episodes of confusion, right, that we detect through the phrase. This would probably be what it looks like, okay? Yes, not because the coffee is hot, okay? Your electrodermal activity shows a spike and a continuous spike in arousal compared to your baseline, right? Your concurrent verbal protocol indicates to us that you're not using an effective strategy, learning strategy, etc. The question for us becomes, right, from an educator's perspective or an interventionist perspective, if we want to build an AI system, well, which one of those self-regulatory processes do we tackle first, right? And this kid says basically in terms of task value, I don't care about this. I don't understand why I'm learning this. So what do we tackle first? Our models don't tell us that. Do we tackle the motivation first? Because if we don't have you motivated and engaged, then what's the use of trying to teach you emotional regulation strategies or how to make inferences, right? So this is something that we really, hopefully we'll get to explore this during the workshops. It's like, how do we prioritize those processes? How much sampling of the multimodal data do we need to make inferences about whether somebody, for example, now has better self-efficacy, right? Which tends to be qualitative. And a lot of the data mining and machine learning techniques that we're using is focusing a lot on the quantitative measures, but what about the qualitative measures of self-regulation, right? Can we predict when a particular student is going to, for example, understand that from a task value, it's like, oh, this is really relevant because all of a sudden it's like, I know what kind of career I want. When does that happen, okay? So there are time scales or temporal scales, etc. And hopefully we'll get to explore a little bit of those during the workshop, okay, because they're open questions. And then we have other issues, and these are learning-specific issues, right? When we design these learning technologies, we design them with a particular goal in mind. It's going to be a particular age group doing a particular task. We have a particular theoretical framework, right? Well, then how do we synthesize across multimodal data that's collected across the world with all the different types of research that is being done, okay? How do we measure those, for example, if you look at the third bullet, the contextual variables and their interaction with other variables, all right? Prior knowledge, oh, that's great. We usually measure it. We use it as a covariate in a statistical analysis. When does prior knowledge change? Because typically, what do? We do pre-test and post-test, right? And there's some point in time here, right? Well, when does prior knowledge change? When do I acquire more knowledge, other than including assessments, right? Those issues. So these seem to be very basic issues, and theories and models. So if you look at that fourth bullet, okay, there's so many different models. If you are interested in the models of self-regulation, then it will be the Shunk and Green 2018 Handbook of Self-Regulation Performance. That's probably the second edition, the best compilation. And not only now we have external regulated learning, or ERL, we also have now SSRL, socially shared regulated learning, that Allison and Sana Jarvala at the University of Oulu have been doing a lot. But now we have co-RL. Okay, what's next? What's the difference? How are they different from each other? When do we get to use them? And then if you look at the second bullet, if you're just going to focus on emotions, okay, there's a CVT, which is Pekrin's model, like control value theory. We have affect dynamics from DeMello and Gracer. We then have the EASY model, the Van Cleef model, which is emotions as social information, okay? We have emotional regulation from James DeGrosse at Stanford. We have the Mars model, the Euclides model, a CPM model, Shares model. We have so many models, even within just one of those traces and one of those self-regulatory processes. The question becomes unbearable. Which one do we use? Now, can I take, for example, the affect dynamics model, which we've been trying to do from Gracer and DeMello, because obviously we're interested in emotions, and then we borrow from Phil Winnie and Hadwin's model of cognition. But wait, what about emotion? Or motivation, which model? And then we write these papers, and then it comes back with the reviewers. They're all confused because it's no longer the idea that, typically you'd write a theoretical framework and it's only one framework, and that's where you derive your hypothesis and research questions. Now it's like, it's an amalgamation, and we get dinged for that. Okay, so what is the new model? So anyway, so some of these issues are important. Here are a list of, and we'll explore this through the workshops, also a list of some of the metacognitive processes that we've been able to detect across different technologies and also students of all ages. So feeling of knowing, judgment of learning is extremely important. That's when you're aware that you are not understanding something. And as a psychologist who studies language, to me it's very important if somebody utters, I understand this, versus I don't understand this, right? The valence is extremely important, but how do you capture that in real time, right? So the idea is, can you use natural language processing to capture that in real time? So we have a model of metacognition in real time based on your verbalizations that can then be fed back into the machine, which could be as simple as an avatar talking to you. It's like, explain to me why you don't understand this. Or I see that you don't understand that, okay? So there's about, so based on our work and several other works that are listed up there under the heading, there's about 15, 20 different coding schemes that are either 5 codes long to something like 40 codes long. Okay, so we can talk a little about that during the workshop. This is just kind of a snippet. And so here's the question. So the question becomes, well, what does this data look like? So here's an example of if you only had access to, can we click on this? Not this one? Oh, okay, all right. So what I wanted to show you here is basically what we did is, with our software developer on Crystal Island, is we said, look, we collect eye tracking data. Why don't we do something simple, right? Imagine giving the researcher or the teacher or the parent, flip the switch and that show the kid the eye tracker. So this was a video of that green dot. It actually shows your gaze behavior. Because we asked the question, if you were to show the students their gaze behavior while they are reading about, I think this one's on viruses, okay? Would that increase your metacognitive awareness of how you are reading? Or if it's a teacher who's coming to see you, would that help him or her understand the reason why you're not getting it is because, based on your gaze behavior, you're not looking at the right content, okay? And that's with one data channel. So this one's not going to work? Okay. This is the one I wanted to show you. I'll show you during the workshop. So this one is what happens when you show. Here you get access to the person, all right? So you can see their body movement, their facial expression, the interaction with the agent, okay? And then the 3 dots on the bottom at the beginning of the eye tracking data, and you have the screen recording. You actually get to see how this person is actually learning, taking notes, what are they selecting, etc. So this is kind of, if you were to take and package the full Monty of all the multimodal data into a video, right? Can we use that to retrain students? Because what happens when we train and teach students and humans, right? It's usually verbal, right? Oh, you didn't do this, you should do this better. Really? I can't see that. How about you show me my actual self-regulatory multimodal data, and would that actually be able to accelerate perhaps learning or training? Because now I get to see it, okay? Or from a teacher's perspective, taking this kind of video and then kind of creating an assessment of the quality of their learning or self-regulation over time, right? So those are things that still kind of need to be explored. And then I want to transition to some of the projects that we have. So we have one with Min Chi, who's in computer science, and Sunyi Park. They're both at NC State. She's in STEM education. She's a qualitative researcher. And one idea was that, here's your typical classroom, at least in the US, right? That kid on the left is real trouble, so you got to keep an eye out for him. We got the bracelet on him, ready to deliver some voltage. Just kidding. Just kidding. We don't hurt our participants. All right, see if everybody's still awake. Much, yeah. It's mild, yeah. It's like, oh, yeah, that's good. Just to activate them. So, typical whiteboard, which is dumb and unintelligent, right? That's sitting there. So the question is, these kids are going to be using MetaTutor, right, to learn about the human circulatory system. So the question is, as researchers, we hug up all this multimodal data. What about we repackage some of that data, right, and feed that back to some data visualization, okay? And so we're going to replace the dumb whiteboard that has no function with a data visualization, okay, of some of this multimodal data, all right? So the big question is, of the multimodal data that we collect, the raw data, right, that nobody really wants to see, it's not consumable by humans, right, other than researchers, right? The question is, the teachers are really our designers and our participants. So the question is, what kind of data would you want to see? Is it their cognition, affect, metacognition, motivation, okay? How do you want to see it? When do you want to see it? And then build a prototype, bring that into the classroom. And now the question is, well, this is what you wanted, right? But now we're going to instrument you, teacher, with the eye tracker and the EEG, okay, and collective verbalization. Because now we want to see is, well, you wanted specific data. So if we can in real time present that data to you, right, do you pay attention to the data? What inferences do you make to the data? And then how do you change your instructional decision making based, right, on your inferences? So that's the goal of the 3-year NSF project. So we did a survey of the 54 teachers in the school that we were assigned to, and believe it or not, 18, so 33% of the teachers are interested in participating, which from us is like, we only included 3 to 5 in the proposal. We don't have enough money. So how can we get more money too? Because the last thing you want to do is if teachers, right? I mean, if we get that kind of excitement, we want to build on that excitement, okay? So the question is, would we provide, for example, individualized student data, right? Because, for example, if they're using MetaTutor, we can tell when you're copying information, which is a good strategy, right? You can copy it and paste into your notebook. But here's a question. At what point, after watching a student copy information, which is a very low-level process, right? Anybody can do that. It's kind of mindless. At what point should the agent, right, prompt the students like, look, I've been watching for X amount of time. Now I want you to paraphrase. When, right? So our models of instruction and cognition don't tell us about those conditions. At what point is it time to get a student to change their strategy? And does it differ based on who the student is? Which I'm sure it is. I mean, we have individual differences, right? So those are some of the things. Or some of the work with Eunice Jang, University of Toronto, who's a psychometrician, and her team, is they've been analyzing some of our log file data, and can we come up with link profiles, and including Christina Canati, is, well, at this point in time, it's, let's say, 30 minutes into my class, I want to see how people are doing in terms of their strategy use and metacognition. Well, it looks like I got 3 classes of students in my class, right? So what are you going to do about that data? Or with Christina Canati is, well, here's some of the, we've shared some of our affect data and eye tracking data. Can we come up with robust signatures based on your gaze behavior to indicate if you are very binary, engaged, which is the yellow, versus disengaged, okay? So even if we had 70% accuracy, that would still be good enough because then the system can actually adapt in real time, right? Does that make sense? All right. Here's some other data. So we're really trying to figure out is, can we use, so the same data that we use, here's some summary data. So that I'll just focus on the top left, for example. There is a heat map of a student using one of the new versions of MetaTutor, okay? The question is, can we use, for example, a heat map that shows your attention allocation as feedback back to the learner so that I could understand the reason I didn't answer the science question correctly, given diagrams and text, is because, look, I focused most of my attention, that's what the red shows over here, and look, we designed her specifically, this intelligent virtual human, to give you facial expressions to indicate your accuracy of metacognition, and look, you hardly spent time on looking at her, so you missed an opportunity because she was giving you feedback through her face that you should have used, okay? Other things that we're doing is also thinking about the training of future data scientists, right? So yes, we keep talking about humans and learners. Well, what about data scientists? So, I know, this one is staged, okay, all right. So I guess we can't show this video either. Okay, all right, I'll verbalize then, sorry. So imagine this is a typical learner in one of our experiments. She's all instrumented, she's using eye tracker, okay. You have a separation, of course, it would obviously be geographically. The researcher is on the right-hand side, would not actually be there, okay? But if you notice, he's also instrumented. And what he's looking at her in his monitor is all the multimodal data that she is generating as she's doing the activity. Because the question now is, I want to study how data scientists, okay, understand and the inferences they're making from the multimodal data that they're collecting for their human learners. Okay, because if we're going to train, for example, now that we are starting a new program in learning sciences, it's not just about, yeah, sure, hey, look, I got an Excel file and SPSS, I got pre-test and post-test, I'm running an ANCOVA. Really? Here's the complexity. This is what we're dealing with. So how do we train to do that? And so you can replace that guy where they can be an undergrad student who's in psychology or educational research or psychology, postdoc, et cetera, including any of us from the different fields, right? How do experts make those inferences? And moving along with that, we also submitted this to the military, which is to do the same thing. She's a data scientist. She's instrumented watching the multimodal data of what these guys are doing, right? But there's an extra element on the bottom, the third bubble there. So the question is, we want to get to the point where your research collaborator is now going to be an intelligent virtual human. Okay, so those two on the bottom are virtual humans that have been developed by University of Southern California, so John Gratch and Stacy Marcella. Okay, and the question is, using computer vision, okay, and deep learning is, I want him and her, or they, it, right? They're observing the human, the data scientist, right, and monitoring her multimodal data as she is observing the multimodal data of these folks, right? So that one day we'll be in a lab like this, and it's going to get scary again, sorry, okay, is we actually submitted a proposal to NSF, is that in a lab such as this one, these things would actually live in the walls, right? So we're a group of data scientists. We're working on multimodal data, right? The instructor's over there, right? Well, if the walls can see, feel, and hear, and we have embedded in virtual humans, why can't they just show up and actually deal with whatever issue? Oh, look, we're looking at this physiological signal here. We have no idea what that means. I can't wait for the physiologist, the faculty to be there. I want the IVH, intelligent virtual human, to actually be able to help us there. Okay, and not to get even scarier, is that imagine them, if, for example, if it's, let's say, medicine, right? They go from being embedded in the wall to actually becoming embodied into some kind of physical format. Okay. All right, so you take me to the airport now, is that it? Sorry, we're getting this guy out of here. Sorry. Other things we're doing is a Teach Live for teacher training, one of our colleagues in computer science. So these are kids, mostly for learning disabilities, really interesting. The question is, can we build self-regulatory profiles that we can embody each of these kids with, right? So you got a kid with high prior knowledge, below emotional regulation skills. And the idea is to instrument the teachers, because now it's like, can you detect what the problem is, and then how do you regulate the problem? Okay. With medicine, now being also part of College of Medicine, I have an appointment there. There's a lot of talk in terms of using virtual reality on augmented reality, but it's basically the same. You know, it's kind of sad. I mean, medicine really hasn't changed much, right? And go and listen. Our team goes and listens to these medical folks, and it's the same thing. It's kind of the didactic approach. Or, you know, here are 5 cases of cough, and they're reading it. Well, a patient doesn't present in text, right? Your body, you show up. So the question is, well, my gosh, why can't we take your 5 cases of cough for the second year medical students, and we build 5 virtual humans that actually stand at the end, right, that I can come up to and interrogate, sorry, let me take that back, use the wrong verb, talk to, right, auscultate, palpate, etc., right? And then I can take that embodied or disembodied patient with me, and it's ubiquitous, because I can have access to it at any time, not just when I come to, you know, teaching with my fellow peers. Right. The other work that we're doing is we also have a children's hospital. So one of my colleagues in STEM, Megan Nichols, has been working with this. She started a pediatric academy. It's one of the few that exist in the country. And so these are children with critical illnesses. So these kids get to basically live in a hospital room. They can't go home. They can't go to school. They can't play. They can't have their pets. Very limited. Okay. So the idea is bringing VR and robotics to them so they can continue learning. Because some of them may have an opportunity to go to school, and maybe for a day or a week, but then they have to come back, right? So it's really, I'm trying to do the best emotional regulation, because every time I talk about this, it gets, when you're there, it's just really, from a human perspective, it's just so powerful, right? So the question really becomes, what do these children who are literally waiting to die, what do they want to learn about, right? How do they self-regulate? What is learning for them? Okay, so completely different. I want to share that with you because I think it's extremely important work, and the question is, nobody's really addressing their needs. Okay, and then, so let's see, I'm trying to be, so we have a lot of work still to be done. I'm trying to be mindful of time. How am I doing? Okay, sure. All right, so we have a lot of work to do. One of them is coming up with a new environment that actually trains undergraduates to do interdisciplinary research. So what would a new lab look like with data visualizations and mixed reality and augmented reality? We're trying to do that since, especially now that we are the largest university in the United States. We just surpassed Arizona State University. So we got tons of students. I think we're up to, 75,000 students. So we're like a major city. Students of different backgrounds also, so it's interesting. A lot of minority students. We are also now a Hispanic serving institution, since more than 25% of our population, student population, is Hispanic. A lot of minority students, and also our biggest problem, actually, and this is a problem for the workforce training, is the community college students who are fed into the community college, who tend to be older, have families, may have 2 or 3 jobs, and have not gone to school probably in about 5-10 years. So they're not used to studying and learning. So what do we do about them, because we want them to be successful? So a lot of work to be done: conceptual work, methodological work, and the continuous work of kind of looking at the interaction between humans and machines, and what is their role, or what are their roles, and especially as we think about self-regulation. And yes, so in terms of acknowledgements, a lot of folks, not only a village, but a big country. Without, whose collaboration, this would not be possible. And we're always looking for new collaborators, because, at least for those of us who love what we do. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Roger. That's fascinating. There's a lot to think about there. So we'll take questions from the room, but while I give you a moment to think about what they are, I'll take a question from online, from Kim. Hi, Kim. Good to see you out there. In relation to the hardware, do you see that commercially available wearables will evolve to allow us to collect and use this type of data more broadly, in parenthesis, privacy and security considerations aside, or will specialist equipment always be preferred?
Yes, that's one of the major bottlenecks. Thank you, Kim, for your question. One of the major bottlenecks is that we got to the point where we're at the mercy of these companies who build sensors, who build devices, and so we're basically forced, if you will, as researchers, to only collect the data for which their sensors are designed to build. So what is the solution? We can see two solutions. One is, so for example, we work a lot with iMotions, who have been very responsive as researchers. So for example, well, we'd like, your sensor to collect this data and then that data. They will actually be responsive, and the next version of their sensors will allow for that data collection. Or do we now kind of diverge and work with, electrical engineers, our computer science colleagues, folks in nanotechnology, to actually build the sensors that, for example, that I need, right? Which is the best path, or there's some kind of hybrid path, and that's still an open question. But there's no good answer for that right now. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks.
Unless somebody else has.
Any questions from the room for Roger? I think we're a little bit stunned. We were thinking about those disembodied humans coming out of the walls.
Sorry. I'll pack my bags. I'll go now. Thank you. Thanks for the visit.
Any more questions for Roger before we sign off? We have one over here. Thanks. Wait for me.
Hi, Andrew. We're working on a project using the kinetic sand that you demonstrated there, just using a Kinect and a projector, so quite basic. Mm-hmm. But would you have any advice around learning activities beyond just student engagement in terms of developing something to allow them to self-regulate? We're thinking of it in a geography context initially, but just any ideas from what you've done?
Sure. I can think of, for example, can we use a data visualization tool that could be included as part of, so if we go back to that slide, let me just flip back to that slide. So I think this is where the role of data visualization tools could be really, really helpful, right? Because imagine now I'm getting frustrated because my partner's not actually collaborating with me, right? There's some reason. I have no idea. I don't really have time to kind of look at her and, is it because she's confused or getting frustrated? So imagine taking this multimodal data and coming up with some kind of data visualization tool that gives me access to the fact that, oh, here's her level of frustration. It can be as simple as a bar graph, it's really high. Oh, so now I look at it. I don't actually have to talk to her. I mean, I can just look at it and it's actionable. right? And so then I'm going to be able to regulate myself, knowing now that she's feeling really frustrated, right? So I think data visualizations could be embedded, right? The other way to do this, I think, is augmenting this with augmented reality, right? And that work has been done by the military who are around our campus. So we have all the 5 branches of the military sitting there. So for example, think about geography. I think you can, part of not being able to problem solve is that I may not have all the right information, right? So the question is, can we use augmented reality to supplement what's already available with a tangible landscape? And what would that look like, right? So in geography, imagine being able to overlay, different layers, right? Or movements, motion of humans, animals, etc. Does that make sense?
Thanks, Roger. Any last questions? We've got one over here. Hang on.
Thanks for the great presentation, Roger. So one question I have is, all of this technology is pretty advanced. So it takes a lot of money to develop these things. So you're aware of that. Mm-hmm. So what do you see the first things that are can be used in the classroom, in the, let's say, public school system, where because I understand you need a lot of technology to be able to get anything, to capture the data. If you only have textbook, you cannot do much analysis. What kind of data we'll be able to collect from a typical class or any reasonably funded public system?
Sure. That's an excellent question, and that's always a problem for us, as you're mentioning. And it causes a problem for funding, right? So the question is, I don't know what most of the schools or classrooms are like here in Australia, but in the US, they tend to be very impoverished. So when we did a simulation project with Gautam Biswas from Vanderbilt, we literally walked into this middle school in Raleigh, North Carolina, and we couldn't even run the simulation because the computers that they had in their computer lab were old computers. It just crashed. So we literally had, okay, you guys start the simulation now, we wait until it's stable, and then it's the rest of the room kind of thing. By that time, they have 20 minutes on task. So the question becomes an infrastructure issue, right? So do we work with schools? So the photosynthesis one that I showed you, this one was easy to do because we worked with a private school. I mean, they had more technology than we had in our own lab. So it's no problem. Oh, you need 5 more headsets? Sure, we'll get you headsets. The next morning they were there, right? But those are also not the kids who need to learn how to self-regulate. They know. They come from very affluent families. They got everything. So the question is, I think it's about sharing. It's about establishing networks of collaborations, right, where we could share resources. So for example, let's say you got 10 laptops or high-end, game laptops. Can we collaborate somehow that, we can use your technology, we can use our technology? I think that has to be with collaboration because even with the National Science Foundation, for example, it's hard. When you submit a typical 3-year grant that's 1.5 million, you lose 50% right away. So you're talking about 750K, right? Because the university eats 52%, right? And then, so with the landscape one, we submitted an NSF proposal where we went to an impoverished school where the teachers were embarrassed of showing me what their computer lab was like. We literally walked in, it was an empty room. There weren't tables or chairs. So about a quarter of the grant went to buying technology for the classroom, including setting up 8 stations, okay? So that's great. But then guess what? 3 years later, right, the grant's over, right? We leave, right? The technology leaves. Who's gonna keep up with the technology? Who's gonna maintain the computational models? Who's gonna be troubleshooting, right? So that's a big problem, and I think so we have to figure out some ways. Now, what we're trying in Orlando is trying to get industry, who have deep pockets, right, to be able to contribute in terms of education and STEM. That's kind of one of the things that we're trying to do, because if we can get them to allocate some of those funds, right, then that would be one solution. But that is a very difficult solution, right? But when you talk to teachers, right, in fact, when I do my dog and pony show for the teachers, we always show them a video of this last. It's like, oh, yeah. That's what we want for our kids. Sure, but what's the price of getting this into your classroom, right?
Thanks very much. Okay, we've got the last question online. from Jason Lodge. Hi, Jason. I'm wondering how Roger and colleagues deal with the signal-to-noise problem in the kind of psychophysiological instruments they use.
Oh, sorry.
Is there an overarching philosophy or set of assumptions for dealing with the messiness of the real-world data?
The simple answer is yes. Get a psychophysiologist to be on your team. Just kidding, but you actually need one, or a psychologist who's a psychophysiologist. That has been one of the bottlenecks, is the physiological data. Just not only the signal, right, and the noise and the error, but what does that signal, physiological signal, actually mean psychologically, right? So we're getting something from biology, it's a signal, and we have a psychological construct. How do we make that inference, right? And so that's a big problem. So we need to work on better ways of actually not only analyzing and deleting error and the noise, but then also being able to actually interpret those signals that are meaningful in terms of understanding learning. That's a continuous problem, right? And if I can add, in terms of grants, we've noticed is that anytime we add psychophysiology into our NSF grants, that's where we get dinged on because of that issue, right? And can you really react to a physiological signal, right? What does it mean? How much do I have to sample, right? Assuming that I can get rid of the error and the noise, right?
Okay, thanks very much. And if we could thank Roger again, and appreciation for a great presentation. Thanks very much. And thanks very much, everybody online. The recording will be sent out presently. And see you all at the next breakfast event. Goodbye. Thanks.
Thank you.